people to be on the same page. And I want to provide some context for why the payments are so important to county governments, especially in the Pacific Northwest. And then I want to highlight some of the potential solutions that are being discussed right now among the counties and in Washington, D.C. So with that, just I think a little bit of context to begin with. County payments are largely a Western issue. The West is about half owned by the federal government, owned and managed by the federal government. And one of the biggest challenges with county payments is building a coalition large enough to get national attention and national action, because it is not a partisan issue in the West, but it is a provincial issue nationally. And so it has always been difficult to get enough attention on these issues that are important to us, but maybe not so important elsewhere. But also just saying that the West is half public misses a really important part of the complexity. There are multiple agencies with multiple mandates, multiple constituencies, and it really complicates the ability of local governments in particular to be able to understand and track and actually affect the management on public lands and have an influence. And the collaboratives that have sprung up around the West in the last couple of decades, I think are one of the places where a lot of innovation and relationships and trust are being built. And a lot of the work that I have done on the county payments programs initially grew out of my participation in a couple of collaboratives, primarily in Central Idaho with the Clearwater Basin Collaborative, but also talking with and working with collaboratives across the West. So I just want to highlight that I think this conversation in particular for the collaborative groups is really important. And so hopefully I will add some value to what those conversations are. So now I want to turn and do a little bit of history and background timeline of county payments to provide some shared understanding. County payments were initially started in 1908 as a revenue sharing agreement. Gifford Pinchot, the first chief of the Forest Service, thought that the revenue sharing arrangement would be fair and adequate compensation for the non-taxable value of federal public lands. It was also a really important synergy for Pinchot, who believed that the conservation of public lands, and in Pinchot's time, conservation meant the use of, the sustainable use of public lands. Revenue sharing provided synergies with growth and development of the West and the communities around public lands. So the basis of payments was really in this relationship between the use of public lands, the conservation of public lands, and economic development at the county level. But Pinchot could not have anticipated the changes that we've experienced over the last 100 and more years. Initially, the county payments programs were not that important. Between 1908 and World War II, on average, revenue sharing payments were about $10 million a year. And that's in inflation adjusted dollars. Those are in 2018 dollars. It wasn't until after World War II that payments became really important, as we had this huge post-war growth nationally, and public lands supplied a lot of the resources to fuel that growth. And so communities in the West grew up around supplying those resources to fuel the nation's needs. But as the payments became more important, weaknesses in the revenue sharing program started to appear. So in 1970, the Public Lands Law Review Commission wrote that although they, meaning the county payments programs, were originally designed to offset the tax immunity of federal lands, the existing revenue sharing programs do not meet a standard of equity and fair treatment, either to state and local governments or to the federal taxpayer. And the three problems that they saw were that county payments were too volatile and uncertain for local governments who needed consistent revenue to fund their road departments and schools. You could have annual volatility of 30% year over year on a national basis. And at the county level, that volatility could be significantly greater because of changes in markets, changes in policies. And so the idea that local budgets would be hooked to what the Forest Service was able to do in any given year seemed unfair to the authors of the report. It was also unfair across counties. Some counties were overcompensated while others were undercompensated, according to Congress, because of the difference in the values of commercial products available on different national forests. And then finally, they were worried about perverse incentives. So hooking county budgets to the provision of commercial receipts from public lands could potentially overshadow some of the other important values delivered by public lands that didn't necessarily generate receipts. So all of that led to the adoption of PILT, Payments in Lieu of Taxes, in 1976. So PILT is an important program that is based on appropriations, and it was intended to try to stabilize and provide equity to the revenue sharing programs. So at its basis, PILT has three basic criteria. One is the number of eligible acres in a county. The second is that you have to subtract from your PILT payment, based on the number of acres, any payments you received from other revenue sharing programs in the previous year. So you have to subtract from PILT payments you received from the Forest Service, from the Fish and Wildlife Service, mineral revenue sharing payments, and other programs. The BLM ONC payments, for some reason, are exempt from prior year payments, but all the others must be subtracted. And the third criteria is population. So PILT is limited by each county's population. There's an important rationale behind that. There are boroughs in Alaska, for example, that have only several thousand people, but tens of millions of acres of public lands, and Congress did not want to overcompensate some small population counties with too much PILT. So those three factors, the number of acres, subtracting prior year payments, and the population limit, are basically how the PILT formula works. But the important thing to remember about PILT is that it was designed very intentionally to work with the revenue sharing programs. It's not a separate program. They are designed together to improve the equity and stability of compensation for non-taxable federal lands. And then finally, when we started to see significant declines in the production of timber, particularly in the Pacific Northwest, Congress stepped in again with additional reforms to provide transition payments to counties that were losing revenue sharing payments. The first transition payments were made to the ONC counties in Oregon, starting in the early 1990s. They were based on 85% of the historic timber payments, the average of timber payments between 1986 and 1990. So that initial transition payment just to the Oregon ONC counties that was based on 85% of historic receipts became the template that was used in the Northwest Forest Plan to extend to all BLM and Forest Service counties within the plan's region that paid 85% of historic timber receipts at a declining rate. So now we introduce the concept of transition payments, right? So they were not supposed to be forever. They were supposed to support counties until the time when the counties could diversify their economies and replace timber payments with revenue from other economic activities that would occur inside the county. In 2000, Congress extended the same basic transition payment framework nationally with the Secure Rural Schools and Community Self-Determination Act. So SRS was initially based on 85% of the three highest payments over a period of years. And that was the Title I payments that would replace the revenue sharing payments that the counties used to receive. Secure Rural Schools is optional, so not counties don't have to take it, but most counties opt in. But the other important thing about Secure Rural Schools is there have been subsequent reforms that have added additional titles that took the funding for SRS from 85% of historic timber receipts up to 100%. And that additional 15% is used in Title II and Title III to try to help diversify economies and promote collaboration through the RACs, the Resource Advisory Councils. So SRS has really introduced new purposes into the county payments program. It's not just compensating for the lost tax revenue associated with public lands. There are now purposes in secure rural schools intended to try to diversify rural economies adjacent to public lands, to deal with direct impacts associated with wildfire and search and rescue needs. And there is an economic adjustment in the secure rural schools formula that tries to give money to counties that have the greatest need. So SRS has really changed the way county payments work to add a whole bunch of new purposes. As we know, though, secure rural schools is also an appropriated payment like PILT, and it has to be both reauthorized and funded on a recurring basis. And PILT and secure rural schools together have not provided the security and the consistency that counties need as a long-term replacement for revenue sharing payments. And so we are now in a situation where a return to revenue sharing payments is problematic because the harvest levels are quite low, and it would return to the uncertainty, inequity, and volatility that Congress was worried about. And secure rural schools and PILT have not provided an adequate replacement. So we still need more assistance on county payments. But there's a lot of other stuff going on too. So I want to provide some context to frame the importance of county payments within a whole bunch of other trends that are happening in the West. One of the biggest things that's happening is we've seen some major structural changes in the regional economy. In the Pacific Northwest, this is pre-COVID, so these are 2018 numbers. 3 cities captured 73% of all new jobs since the last recession. So we've seen this incredible concentration of employment, wealth, and income in cities. 69% of counties that are not connected to urban markets have fewer jobs today than they did in, that number is wrong, in 2007. So between 2007 and 2017, 69% of rural counties lost jobs. There are 2 basic reasons behind that. The first is that we've seen a big change in the nature of employment, away from goods production in manufacturing and natural resource sectors to services. Services are a really complicated set of activities. They include low wage, recreation and hospitality type jobs. They also include very high wage, high skilled doctors, lawyers, financial sector jobs as well. Those latter jobs, the high wage, high skilled jobs and services, are locating in cities for a variety of reasons. They tend to need access to a highly skilled labor force, access to financial capital, and connectivity to global and national markets. And so rural areas are not competing for the high wage jobs in services where most of the new growth is happening in the West. At the same time, rural areas are being hit by significant changes in productivity and automation in a lot of traditional economic sectors. They're being affected by changes in trade. A lot of the low value manufacturing has been outsourced overseas, such as textile manufacturing, while a lot of the high value manufacturing has remained in the United States, but it's been automated. So we need many fewer people to pursue that kind of work. This graph shows that since 1987, employment in manufacturing has dropped by 1/3, while output has increased by nearly half again, and productivity has more than doubled, right? So we're seeing this across manufacturing, but a lot of other industry sectors as well, including timber, where automation in the woods and consolidation and automation in mills means that many fewer workers are needed, and wages in those sectors have been largely stagnant for the last several decades. So rural areas are being hit on both sides, from an inability to compete for high wage service sector jobs, and because of declines in the ability of traditional sectors to support rural communities. So we looked at all of the counties in the Pacific Northwest that were dependent on timber revenue in 1990. Timber employment, sorry, in 1990. And we wanted to know what's happening to them now. And one of the really surprising things that jumped out at us is that your level of dependence on timber in 1990 has no relationship to your current economic performance. Each dot on these vertical graphs, looking at population change, average wages, household income, college degrees, and poverty rates, is a county. And you can see they're all over the map, and there's virtually no relationship. What does matter is the trajectory that your economy was already on in 1990. So if your economy was already diversifying, you continued to diversify and grow despite the loss of a major employer like a mill or harvesting jobs. If you were not diversifying before 1990, then you have largely not done so since, and you've continued to fall behind. The three ways in which rural areas have largely diversified and grown is either because they're connected to metro markets and they are participating in that high wage service sector growth. And connection can mean either you're adjacent to a city or you have an airport with convenient daily flights that connects you to that city. Rural areas with universities have a highly skilled labor force, highly educated labor force, and they tend to be growing and diversifying. And then communities that have amenities are attracting people and businesses around national parks and gateway communities. Outside of that, if you don't have an airport, a university, or a national park, you're probably not growing. You're probably experiencing the loss of jobs and income and population. The one thing that seems to matter the most in that cohort of counties that are falling behind is fiscal policy, including county payments, but some other drivers as well. Natural resource sectors are still important in those rural communities. There's a lot of timber being produced in the Pacific Northwest. It's just no longer returning the jobs, the income, and the revenue that it once did. And there are several reasons behind that. The first is that during the heyday of timber, the amount of revenue coming into counties through county payments, severance taxes, and property taxes was so great that they were able to provide high quality services and maintain very low taxes on individuals and other businesses. So timber revenue became addictive. It became easy to maintain low taxes. And this graph shows a correlation between tax rates, property tax rates in the green bars, and the share of revenue that comes from O&C timber payments in the red bars. And so the counties that receive the highest payments maintain the lowest taxes. Sometimes that was local choice, sometimes it was mandated by state policy. So it wasn't just that counties were maintaining lower tax rates, but Oregon and other states had a tax revolt at the same time. Oregon's tax revolt not only froze tax rates, which made it hard for those communities to raise their rates, but it also froze assessments. And so new economic development in Oregon counties, and this is also true in Colorado, somewhat in Montana, definitely in Idaho and other places that had similar types of tax revolts, new economic development does not pay enough to cover the costs associated with new service demands from growth. So counties have largely been blocked from diversifying their economy and realizing fiscal benefits from it. And the third problem is that we have a relatively anemic approach to economic development. We use tax incentives to try to create jobs, which reduces the revenue benefit of new growth even further. So we've looked a lot at the energy transition, moving away from coal and oil and gas into renewable energy. This is an example from Colorado, where if a coal-fired power plant of 100 megawatts is replaced with a solar farm of 100 megawatts, an equivalent size, the county receives only about 30% of property tax revenue and no severance taxes associated with the fuel. So renewable energy does not work for communities because it doesn't replace the revenue from lost fossil fuel generation. The same thing is happening when a timber mill shuts down and a different type of business opens, which might have the same number of jobs or same employment associated with it. It doesn't generate the same kind of benefits. So in one of the many task forces in Oregon looking at the problem of county payments, they went in some depth into the fiscal policy challenges, including the tax revolt and incentives, and it led some of the task force members to conclude that the counties cannot build and diversify themselves away from dependence on county payments. Every new resident is a negative on the budget. So in some pretty fundamental ways, the loss of county payments is not happening in a vacuum, but counties have had their hands tied behind their backs in ways that make it very difficult for them to replace that lost revenue, increasing the importance and the pain associated with the loss of county payments. So we need some fixes. So I will last turn to two of the proposals that I've been involved in. And I want to say that these are interesting ideas. If they pass, they would certainly help counties and county budgets substantially, but they are not the only ideas, and I don't want to present them as you know, saying that we have to go down this path or else, right? These are just ways to start the conversation and keep the conversation going. The first one is that PILT was not designed for its current role in the county payments landscape. When PILT was first adopted, it was only 18% of total compensation to local governments. PILT has increased in importance as it has both received full funding since 2008, but also as secure rule schools payments have declined. Right now, it is somewhere around 50 to 60% of total compensation without secure rule schools. If secure rule schools is not reauthorized, PILT rises to 87% of total compensation to counties. PILT was not designed to do that. So for a lot of small population counties that used to receive significant timber payments, they are limited from getting more PILT. So PILT does not replace timber payments for many rural counties in the West, the counties that will be most affected. It's not a solution. PILT does not pay schools. It only goes to county governments. So the school districts that receive, in some states, half or more of the secure rule schools payments will not be compensated for the loss of those. PILT has an urban bias baked into it because of the population limits. And then the last thing, when PILT was passed, there was significant conversations in the congressional record about the role of recreation on public lands. And secure rule schools, timber revenue sharing payments, nor PILT address the values associated with conservation and recreation on public lands, or address the actual costs to communities associated with facilitating that development or trying to leverage economic benefits by being able to provide services to tourists as they come to town or businesses that want to locate. So PILT might need some reform if it is going to continue to be more important in county payments. And the small PILT Parity Act introduced by Senator Daines would start that reform in a marginal way by extending the population limit downward from 5,000 to smaller population counties. It would help a handful of counties across the West. But I think the most important thing about that process is that it is an introduction to the idea that PILT was not designed for its current role, and it opens potentially conversations to some more reforms. The second major proposal right now is the Wyden-Crapo bill to create an endowment to fund a permanent reauthorization of secure rule schools. And I'll just go through this really quickly and then we can get into it, question and answer if people are interested. So right now, counties have an option of getting their revenue sharing payment or secure rule schools, if secure rule schools is funded. What the endowment proposal would do is, instead of spending those receipts on an annual basis, it would create an endowment at the federal level. Receipts would be invested into the endowment to start growing a dedicated permanent funding source that would pay for a permanent reauthorization of secure rule schools. So the first thing the act does is permanently authorize and fund secure rule schools. The second thing is it creates an investment vehicle to fund it without the need for appropriations. So it's designed to create long-term growth in income from receipts, create predictable and permanent funding for secure rule schools, which then goes back to counties and schools to make sure that program is viable. I'm going to end there and turn it over to the commissioners. So hopefully that provides a little bit, I know that's a lot of information very quickly, but hopefully we can dig into things in question and answer and get some more perspective from the commissioners. So thank you very much. And I will stop sharing my screen.
All right. Next up, we have Commissioner Tom Lannen from Skamania County. The share screen. You're on mute. Let me unmute you. Oh, the screen sharing is up. I think you're still muted. Tom, I'm trying to manually unmute you, but oh, there it goes. Looks like you're unmuted. And we can see your slides. You might just want to put it in, hit in present mode.
In what mode?
If you just might hit presentation mode on the PowerPoint, but we can see your slides.
All right, let me get back to the, so we're going to go to slideshow. And that is present online.
Yeah, if you hit, play from beginning, that should work. There, perfect.
Okay. Pardon me. So it's interesting in the path that I've been on for the past several years to see how well it kind of meshes with what Mark's presented. So Skamania County, we have about 11,000 residents. We have 1,100,000 acres. And for about 10 years, I've been following the impact of federal agencies on rural counties. And so, pardon me, it's interesting because there's a slide very similar to Mark's. And when we talk about moving forward with legislative fixes, I think this slide is important because you look at 47% of the Western states are owned by the federal government, some agency or another, but it's only 4% east of about the 100th meridian. And so it's hard to get traction with a lot of people back east in terms of their comprehension, I think, of what happens here. Another one that I look at is the where the population centers are. Where the population centers are is where the political power is. It's also where the money is. And so you can see this teeter-totter is definitely favors the eastern side. And again, one of the things that we always think about, and goes back to what Gifford Pinchot had said, societies rely on rural counties for most everything that they have. So how does that impact Skamania County's budget? So our budget that is controlled by the county commissioners is about 14 million. This is 2019. And we have a lot of people in the county that kind of think that natural resources is not an important portion of the budget and the services that they receive. But when you break it down and you look at what we call discretionary spending, which is this half of the pie, 50% or so, non-departmental revenues, 26% of that budget comes from private harvest tax, which is the larger holdings from people like Weyerhaeuser, SDS, and others, or it comes from U.S. Timber or SRS. We have not taken SRS timber receipts probably for at least 25 years because SRS has always been substantially more. And then we have the DNR state trust lands that produce revenue for us. That's the most predictable and sustainable of any of those resource strains. The other interesting portion is that we only have about 2% of the entire county that's taxed at full market value. So that's another strain. The other one is when we talk about collaboratives. Collaboratives, I believe, were initially formed to work with stewardship sales with the Forest Service. So for the Gifford Pinchot Forest today, about 50% of all timber sales are stewardship sales. And so a lot of people had a hard time trying to understand that, and this was my attempt to try and demonstrate what it looks like. You've got a timber sale here that normally delivered to 25% of receipts to the county's budget. And again, if it was a timber sale, 25% fell directly to the commissioner's budget. If a local contractor got some or all of those timber contracts, there was the impact of the family wage jobs, people living in the county, people buying their goods and services in the county. If you move over to the stewardship sales, we lose the 25%. And if all of the services for a particular sale fall into the companies in the county, then at least there is a side stream that comes back to the county. If you start splitting those services, more of the revenue leaves the county totally. And if all of the services are awarded outside of the county, there is no economic benefit to the county. So when we go and look at the numbers that Mark had put up there, this is kind of a snapshot of Skamania County. The green here indicates what the actual timber receipts were up until 1990. And that's when, pardon me, the NSO started to impact the Northwest Forest Plan. So we had the OWL payments, and they accrued to the county at a declining rate up until 2000, which is when the SRS programs began. And that was originally a 6-year program. And it didn't have to be reauthorized. Since then, every 2 years, we make our trip back to DC with our hand out asking for reauthorization. In 2016, it was not reauthorized and it dropped to zero. PILT did pick up considerably, and Mark's graph showed that. I had not included that in this one. I was focused more on the SRS side of things. So we had a commissioner who signed his emails with Skamania County, the home of this Mount St. Helens monument, the Gifford Pinchot Forest, and the Columbia River National Gorge Scenic area, where only 1.8% of our land is taxed at full market value. I spent some time in marketing in my other life, and I had to have a visual of that. So we produced what we call the Skamania stick. And I needed to represent what that meant. So the red of the stick is 800,000 acres of federal land. And again, some counties have sent tax bills to the federal folks. Ours would be about 18 million if it were taxed at the lowest possible tax rate. The gray, the small little band there, we have a number of fisheries and reserves, again, never taxed. Green is the private sector. Last year they cut about 48 million in revenue for them. The county got 0.006% of that, or about 200,000. And that is not predictable or sustainable for us. If you look at the blue, that's the state DNR trust lands, and there's both school board lands and state forest lands. The state forest lands accrue to the county's budget. That's about 8% of the county, and they typically produce somewhere between $1.2 million and maybe $1.8 million. But again, it does fluctuate. White is the amount that we can tax at full market value, 19,000 acres. And from that previous slide that you saw, the county only gets about 15% on each tax dollar. 50% goes to schools, and the rest is to the other junior taxing districts. So being an old guy, I like to say that's how we got the short end of the stick. We look at tourism versus timber. That was the topic that Mark spoke to in terms of offsets. The average tourism job in the county pays about $20,000. The average job in the mill that we have probably is closer to 60. Those are family wage jobs. And unfortunately, people that work in the tourism side of things, typically you've got a number of them living in an apartment where they're sharing places with them. The other one, in terms of trying to recover, there just is not much land that is suitable for any development in the county. And then we have the Columbia River Gorge National Scenic Act that impacts us. But this was staggering to me when I looked at it, and this is from the Washington State Department of Employment Security, that the average annual wage of people who have a job in the county, and that's important, we'll get to that in a second, has only increased 7% over the past 30 years. For the rest of the state, it went from about 38 to about 62. If you take King County out of it, which is a huge economic driver, we get a slightly less, but that staggered me that that was only an increase of about $2,300 a year. So in terms of being a bedroom community, we have about 5,500 people who live in the county who have a job, and that's probably down a bit with COVID. But of that, 3,600 leave the county every morning, and they take their paychecks with them. We have very little commercial development in the county, so when people go to Portland, Vancouver, or White Salmon and Hood River, they basically take their paychecks with them. It's where they buy their gas, their food. You want a pair of shoes, that's where you're going to get it, flat screen TV. So that is a tax loss to us in terms of sales tax. And then within the county, we have 35% or about 1,800 folks that have jobs in the county. But also we have 300 people that are part of that number that come from outside the county. And again, when they leave, at the end of the day, they take their paychecks with them. So I am reminded of what Mr. Pinchot said and its importance to us. I look forward to having more conversation about the collaboratives and what commissioners can do with that. And with that, I thank you for your time.
Great. All right. Next up, we've got Commissioner Court Boice from Curry County on the southwest Oregon coast.
There we go. Well, good day all. Thanks for the invite. Commissioner Lannen, I heard those Washington County commissioners were a bit sophisticated, so I wore a tie in your honor today. Also on your Mount St. Helens, I always wanted to run that river. It's not the Green River, I can't remember now, but I wanted to run it by jet boat, see how far I could get up there. I see we have Rocky McVeigh has joined us, and I hope he'll be able to contribute. He's been executive director of AOCC for about 25 years now, and he's certainly our go-to person down here. Also noticed Lane County Commissioner Bernie. So not sure if he's still on, but wanted to welcome him if that's okay, Jenna. Introduction to Curry County. I became commissioner in early 2017, and I almost literally was baptized by fire. We have 1 million acres in our county, and we've had 6 major catastrophic fires in 32 years. And we've burned 1 million acres. And obviously some of that has been, unfortunately, reburns. They're not natural fires, although that is usually a good thing. But in that timber lost watershed, our rivers, you know, as you look at the western part of the United States, the coast, Curry County is the most rugged part of the whole North American continent there. Some would say it's the most diverse. It's the most unique national forest. perhaps in the 48 continental states there, but it should also be the most productive. When we went through the 2017 Chetco Bar Fire, straight up statistic, of the 192,000 acres we lost, 12,000 were private timber. Some of that was recovered, not a lot. It was harvested about 12, 15 years earlier than we would have liked, or the private owners would have preferred. The point is this: of that 172,000 acres remaining, we were only able to harvest of the burned timber in a 3-year period. Hard to believe, at 2%. Having said that, there's a lot of good things that are happening, both through AOCC, the BLM counties, with the Forest Service, not to leave out the Oregon Department of Forestry. We're sitting here right now, approaching the 3rd week in August, and we could have 2 consecutive years where we don't have a catastrophic fire. I'm sure you recall in 2018, we lost, not all of it was in Curry County, about 2/3, but we lost another 170,000 acres. So in 14 months, we lost well over 320,000 acres. I raised my family in the Rogue River Wilderness, so I'm pretty sensitive to the natural beauty we have here. And so I went through the Blossom Bar Fire of 2005, certainly the Biscuit Fire, largest fire in Oregon history, right at 500,000 acres. So I love history. I sometimes reference Jedediah Smith, who came through here just 20 years after the Lewis and Clark expedition. And I think it might be safe to say that he's the first one that coined the term healthy watersheds. He noticed some of the most pristine rivers, if not the most, in North America. Certainly the Idaho rivers could compete. And, I always say Washington, I have grandchildren in Washington. I always say, yes, Oregon has the rivers. Washington has the incredible mountains. And so when he got here, he noticed these giant trees, this incredible ecosystem, and the geography where our mountains drop almost vertically straight into the ocean. So he took note. And so since I've been commissioner, I've spent almost 50% of my time, if not a little more, just in trying to do my best to understand our natural resources and what that means for our citizens, what it means for just keeping up with Oregon's heritage, Oregon's history, the tremendous forest we have here, what I often call, heard others suggest, not a Boice original, but just the heritage we have with the Great Oregon Advantage. And so I feel like my job is to understand, to the best of my ability, where our natural resources are going in fishing, which is really hurting right now because of the compromise of the rivers, especially the Chetco and the Illinois. One comes down the east side of the north side of the mountain, and the other one comes down the south side of the Kalmiopsis Wilderness ridges. So our job is to build back, and it's a 2-pronged challenge when you do have the county funding to keep our services going. And so I'm starting to learn that better. Mr. Haggerty, really happy that you mentioned the Senate Bill 1643 with the widened crapo. I'm not sure that that's the best route to go, but it certainly deserves, I think, some review and some support, at least through amendments. I think it's got a lot to offer. And I've been told numerous times the SRS, the PILT payments it's a very complicated system. So when you're a new commissioner coming in and you try and understand that, and then be responsible to promote it to your citizens so they can likewise learn it slow but sure, that complicated system needs to be, I think, greatly amended so that it is a system for the Western United States, and especially those counties, areas that are so, yes, Curry County, 66% federal land. So that was a very good map you brought up, Commissioner Lannen, and also Mark Haggerty, thank you. The key phrase is payment in lieu of taxes for that non-taxable federal land. So relating to fire, catastrophic fire. Again, I understand normal fires, and those usually bring reasonably good results. And that brings me to our collaboratives. I had people in the beginning as I became commissioner say, don't waste your time. Almost that blunt. But I've also had Forest Service representatives that have asked me to do my best to contribute, to participate. And it is a slow process, but I see, in all honesty, I see some positive things that are happening, and I hope I can contribute to that. And I think it's the long term. We just finished our Shasta Agnes program, and there's going to be a reasonable amount of timber that can supply our 2 local mills in Curry County. As you probably know, Josephine County, our neighbor to the east, does not have any more mills, but we have 2 healthy mills here that is tough for them to compete because they're on the coast of Oregon. And so for them to bid for timber with other timber operators, they make the note that, hey, we have 180 of our bid area that's because of the oceans off the. So the point is, it's tougher for them. So back to the collaboratives, I'm just happy to give that a chance. When I first became commissioner, I learned from the Eastern Oregon commissioners that it's sometimes, I understand, comparing apples with oranges, they've had some very good successes on the western side of the Cascades. A lot of commissioners tell you, hey, I was in that for 2 or 3 years, didn't produce results, too slow a process, too much time. But from the Wild Rivers Coast Forest Collaborative and working with the Southern Oregon Forest Restoration Collaborative that basically takes in Josephine and Jackson County, and just building the relationships with the BLM, with the Forest Service, certainly, I really see some efforts to push back against the catastrophic fires and prevention. They're making an honest effort to work within a collaborative system. So again, I want to give that a chance. I'm available for questions, excuse me. I heard Mark Hager also remind us of the multiple uses. Living here all my life, born here, our citizens really watch that close. They want access to the forest, and I even see some reasonable improvements there that give me good optimism. And then yes, I just mentioned the moldy agencies, and I do sense a new spirit. I see the relationship building, and I'm just grateful for that. I got a lot to learn, but I think I'm definitely going to be here another 4 years, and so I hope I didn't take too much time here. But again, available for. And one stat. I serve on the AOCC board, and boy, it helps people to understand that in those 18 counties, and Rocky can correct me certainly if I'm wrong, but I'm sure it's the natural growth of those forests is 1.2 billion board feet a year. And the struggle that those 18 counties have had that goes along with everything that's been presented so far today is we are averaging less than 300,000 million board feet harvest a year. So it grows out of control. It's easy to promote this part of the country as the highest quality, fastest growing trees in the world. And it brings me back to the Jedediah Smith watershed and those beautiful pristine rivers. And I've got 4 years, maybe a little longer, to do my part to build back our forest and those watersheds and that whole geographical forest that we're so proud of here in Oregon and all of the Northwest. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Court. So we're going to go to the Q&A portion of the webinar. We're going to keep it, because we have so many people on here, we're going to keep it to the panelists, and you have the option to message me questions or comments, and you can specify whether it's for a particular speaker today or if you want to ask all 3 of them. So you can go ahead and type those in the chat box. Great. All right, we've got, let's see. One question here for Tom. You pulled up a slide on showing comparing the county revenue impacts of the timber sales versus stewardship contracting. How would, with stewardship, with the county payments, with the secure rural schools, you wouldn't be getting the timber payments anyway. But obviously that is not an assured program with it having to be reappropriated every year. How would something like the trust fund or other model change your opinion about stewardship contracting, which does use best value bidding, which might have an economic development benefit, even if it doesn't immediately benefit, go directly to the county? Tom, looks like you're muted. Oh, I think I have to unmute you. Let's see.
All right, there we are. Thank you. So just to kind of rephrase the question, because stewardship payments are substantially greater than the timber sale payments, how would the stewardship play into long-term? For us, we still have a mill and some people that work on the ground. And so it's important to us that those 100+ jobs stay in the county, and that mill does a pretty good job of being awarded contracts in the forest. So we look at it from the standpoint, when I first got engaged with the collaborative 10 years ago, I was new to the timber industry, so I had a lot of learning to do. It took me a while to understand how restricted the Forest Service is by the congressional side of things. So anytime we want to change something, we really need to look more to DC than necessarily our regional foresters. But the impact is substantial for us in terms of keeping the existing infrastructure operable and the contribution that makes. And so, a long-term trust fund definitely would be beneficial. I think one of the things that, as I listened to Mark, was I think the initial funding for that trust fund was 6.7 million. And there was also funding for additional PILT basic dollars. So the question is, in the interim, there still needs to be some SRS funding until that can be put together. Now, I think most of the counties that receive SRS are going to get that through the end of 2021. And then after that, basically there isn't anything at this time, unless we can get PILT increased or you can get SRS reauthorized. I don't know if that addressed the question.
Great. All right, next question. Looks like it's for both commissioners. Do the county commissioners view the Forest Service use of Good Neighbor Authority as a tool to add capacity to help restore national forests and make them more fire resilient? What is the view of the use of GNA, and how do you see it as additive?
Court, take that.
Thank you, Jenna. It's controversial, but I think it deserves some time. It's kind of like the stewardship program. Do the counties lose a little bit of authority or control or even input? I'm not sensing that from the Oregon Department of Forestry. I give them high marks. I give the Forest Service high marks. The Forest Service doesn't have, they're shorthanded. And so when there's projects that the state can take over a little better role, a little bigger role, of course, like we've all said here today, pre-COVID, So I want to give the Good Neighbor Authority an opportunity. We do, though, through both that and the stewardship program, that money doesn't come back to the counties. People that I'm familiar with, some will say, okay, but they're rebuilding the forest, which we know we have to do. The other side of that, of course, is the funds that don't come back to the county. So again, I just want to give it a chance, and we'll go from there.
Okay, I think I've got pretty much the same perspective that Court does. We were surprised when that was first announced by our Public Lands Commissioner a few years ago. And my first question to her was, what revenue stream is there for the county? And of course, the answer was there was none. But we have worked with them. We've actually been able to help with some aspects of it. And I think the long-term goal is to see how well it can come together, and if it could ever get to the point where there may be some revenue stream to come back to the county. I think one of the things, we have to look at every possible option for income that we can. And I think there's a broader program now where they're reaching out even across the state lines on some of the forests. It's called, I think, the shared stewardship programs. But again, I think from the county's perspective, it's a wait and see. And we certainly agree that the restoration or the revamping, I guess, of the forest, for lack of a better term, in terms of addressing this added acreage or added board feet that Court mentioned is critical. I think our forest has added about 9 billion board feet over the last 20 years of the Northwest Forest Plan that hasn't been addressed. So we have a lot of fuel sitting around waiting to either become marketable or contribute to the CO2.
Yeah, a lot of our commissioners see it as a risk, and the commissioners have been here longer than I have. They look at, it seems like every time we turn around, we have to battle for those funds. But those are during the years, the worst years, hopefully, that we can point to what we believe has not been good forest management through the managing agencies. So we're watching that risk really close and seeing what the long-term benefits are for the counties. But yeah, we often have to fight for those funds to come back to the county, and yet still be a player in much better management. That's got to be the goal.
Great. Let's see. All right. So the next question is for Mark. You mentioned that counties started diversifying their economies in the early 1990s, and those counties fared better under the Northwest Forest Plan. What recommendations would you make to counties now to diversify their economic development opportunities?
So the Northwest Forest Plan included some transition assistance funding and also some significant funding for ongoing monitoring of the communities affected by the Northwest Forest Plan. And what the monitoring has turned up is that the trajectory of the economy in 1990 predicted your performance today better than any other metric, right? So if you were already diversifying, you continue to do so. Those counties that were diversifying had a set of advantages. They were connected to urban markets, or they had a national park, or they had a university. The key, I think, is what the counties that don't have those assets can do now. They have not successfully diversified. There are still valuable resources. And I think the key switch that needs to be made is, instead of extracting those resources at lowest cost, trying to shed jobs and increase productivity and use tax incentives to cut the liability of the industry to get them to cut more, we need to rethink it and start thinking about building wealth in those communities from the resources. And so the idea that the endowment is after is to, when you have a high price or you get the volume back up, you're able to take that revenue and invest it for the long term. So you start thinking about long-term solutions that build some resilience and stability in county budgets, that allow counties to start providing services and access to public lands and infrastructure that can help them both kind of leverage the resource opportunities that they have, and to the extent that they have other competitive advantages, start investing in those and make them work too. So the kind of critical piece of fiscal policy and county payments is to get off of the annual cycle and the idea that lowest cost is best, and start creating value in the industry again, and then using that revenue to create long-term wealth and solutions. So that's what we're trying to work on with these rural communities that have not already successfully diversified.
Got a lot of questions on G&A, and I'm just going to take this opportunity to plug that we have a G&A specific webinar coming up, and I'll go ahead and just share the link out for that. Let's see here. How would you, and this is the question for all of you, is what advice do you have for not only forest collaborative members, but forest district rangers and supervisors and Forest Service leadership for connecting with county commissioners and talking through some of these issues when it comes to more local level solution. We talked about some high level policy solutions on a local level. What advice do you have for wading in these issues? Any of you can jump in.
I'll defer to the commissioners first.
You have to unmute. Oh, Tom, I tried to remute.
Okay.
There we go.
All right. I think the first thing for me, because I got involved in the collaborative well before I became a commissioner, it was just this disconnect that I saw between this incredible resource sitting there and the financial status of the county. And it took a couple of years to really begin to get an understanding of how everything is interconnected. Pardon me, the restrictions that the Forest Service has placed on it, from the budgets and the amount they spend for fires, and just the congressional involvement. And so once you begin to understand that, I guess to the first question that you put out there is, why did I become involved? It was because of the economic side of things. And if I go forward, why do I stay involved as a county commissioner when there really is not a great deal of direct return from the financial side of it? It's because, pardon me, we're all still part of the same community. And being at the table, you have a voice as opposed to being on the menu. And I think a lot of commissioners probably, you look at it as, what's my time worth and what's the return that I get for being there. I think it's substantial for our county. We've had a very contentious history with the Forest Service from the time the owl was introduced, and then also the National Scenic Area that the Forest Service manages. And so there was a lot of bad blood. And so you're trying to work together and see what we can do together is important. We have huge recreational impacts on the forest because of the Portland, Vancouver area. We have an awful lot of people coming in. You know, Good Neighbor Authority at least helps keep some of the roads in conditions that allow recreation to continue. And so my advice to other commissioners would be, number one, what is it that your long-term goal is? And if you understand the limitations of the Forest Service and that they're heavily influenced by DC, you need to be able to engage at that level. And then the other one is, there are a number of ways that counties can engage with federal agencies. You can do consultation, collaboration, cooperation, or coordination. And a lot of counties find that those are much more effective means of advancing their positions as opposed to being into collaborative. So from a commissioner's standpoint, what's the best path forward? Mine would be to use both, stay engaged with the collaborative, but also work directly with the other agencies and governmental entities. End of report.
Great. Court, let's re-unmute you here, and Mark, advice.
Commissioner Lannen, very well said. I couldn't add much except speed up the process. If you can take that responsibility individually, encourage you to do that. Look where the successes have been in the Northwest. When I first met new Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest Supervisor Mert Gorge almost 3 years ago now, he made it clear he understood that, to your point, Commissioner Lannen, that it was going to take a while for the Forest Service to build that trust back. And he and his people, I believe, have been very dedicated to earning that respect back. And it's really, again, built those bridges, those relationships. And so I had the privilege of talking to Glenn Casamassa back in late May I was bragging to one of my friends. I got to talk to him 35 minutes and he says, well, you should have only took 30, you were 5 minutes over. And I said, well, the guy knows what he's talking about and he's a river guy. So it was just to get his philosophy on forest management and the job that he has before him. We've only lost 1 acre in Curry County bringing it back to fire and rebuilding. We've only lost 1 acre in our county so far this year. But I'd like to defer to Terry Fairbanks, who is one of our go-to people here. She's in Jackson County. We're always trying to get her to move to Curry County, but through the Southern Oregon Forest Restoration Collaborative, she has just been really, really helpful. I know you know her well, Jen. So I just wanted to acknowledge her here also. Thank you.
Great. Mark, any additional comments?
Yeah, in my experience working with rural communities, there's a real issue with lack of capacity. In a lot of these communities, the same folks, Tom and Court, are the commissioners, you're on all the planning committees, you're serving on the fire district boards. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of social capital, but it's limited in your ability to participate. And so what the collaboratives can do, what the Forest Service, the agencies, and some of the nonprofits like Sustainable Northwest and RVCC and others can do, is really invest to build the capacity of those communities so that their local priorities and their local solutions can get scaled up to actually start solving some of these bigger problems. And so, there's a clear need for national policy direction and some investment into the collaboratives and the collaborative process so that the people who are on the ground thinking and working on this stuff all the time can be heard, and we can start to find those solutions and scale them up. And so I think that's the key role of the collaboratives. And, it's partially just funding, making sure that there's food and time and staff to make things happen between meetings, and then just building those relationships and trust. So, I see them as really valuable parts of of the policy solutions at the local and national level.
How is that economic development? Plus, I'm a Trump supporter. So is most of our county.
Great. I've got another question for all three panelists here. To what extent have the panelists thought about means of diversification for rural economies that would potentially solve multiple challenges, including wildfire management and climate change risks? How are they framing these transitional conversations? And are there interesting, promising solutions emerging?
I think some of the work that's being done around the restoration economy is pretty interesting, right? So if you think about forest products, there's commercial timber sales, which is an important tool in some cases, but there's a whole other set of values coming out of forest products that are not necessarily recognized in receipts or in the kind of commercial benefit that goes back to communities. And so trying to diversify the ways in which sales and contracts and projects can be designed to maximize the number of values that are being produced, and then to try to monetize those. And that's probably going to be, it's going to be appropriations at some level because there aren't markets for a lot of these things. But trying to add value in those ways. And that's one of the challenges, right? Because the county budgets are linked to commercial receipts. And as long as county budgets are linked to commercial receipts, those other values are not recognized and they're not elevated to the same level. And so, part of the purpose behind the trust is not necessarily to monetize those directly, but to guarantee counties minimum payments, equal to your secure rural schools, to invest the money where it does come in, but that frees up the ability to use more creative solutions and more tools to create jobs around a whole set of values coming off the forest. And so, that's part of the idea. And the other kind of interesting thing that we've talked quite a bit about with the trust is that once you have the principle in the trust established, one of the things that these rural communities lack is access to capital. So if you're trying to build infrastructure, if you're trying to maintain the businesses and the infrastructure to actually manage forests, private capital is often not going to go into these communities. It's too risky. So could you use public finance through the trust model to actually start building the capacity to extend the pace and scale of activities out on the forest that are needed for fire suppression and other things? So that's, I think that's the way to start thinking about it. And we need new tools. We need new ways to capture value. I think that's essential.
I am intrigued by what Mark has put forward in terms of diversification. And we had a chat the other day when he mentioned the use of possibly using some of the trust fund monies to finance projects back in the counties, which is, I thought, a pretty good idea that certainly deserves a lot more conversation. But I think that I'd like to have further conversation with Mark relative to what some of those other opportunities are and how he sees those bringing value. One of the things that I was amazed at when you look at the impact of the national scenic area on the county, we've got 87,000 acres that it's a band about 20 miles deep, the width of the county along the Columbia River. And there's urban development zones, which are where you can do commercial things. And that is 7,800 acres. And that's where all of the development already exists. So we have housing there. We have the, whatever commercial infrastructure that, is in the county is already there. And so there, I just see so many different constrictions that are placed on us. And then to speak to Court's comment about rugged terrain, we're certainly not as dramatic as the coast there, but we certainly did not have much flat land or agricultural land. I think there's 8,000 acres in the county that qualify for agriculture, and they're probably mostly in grapes right now. But I'd like to continue that conversation.
The only thing I would add is on the Good Neighbor Authority, there's opportunities there to put people to work. We have a shortage of firefighters. We have a shortage of fuel reduction people. So the combination there is 8 months of the year, you're 4 of those months, you're firefighting, 4, you're doing fuel abatement, road clearing, just the heavy fuels reduction we have. And then you have 4 months off. So we're trying to figure out ways, especially in this part of the state, of how we can increase employment and really look to encourage people on good potential careers.
Great. All right, we've got another question. How is SRS secure rural schools? What sidebars are put on it for counties and how they distribute it to schools within the counties? Is a question. Is it up to the county commissioner's discretion into where it goes in the budget, or are there a number of sidebars there for going to the most needy schools?
I'll take the first crack because it's different in every state. So the payments actually go to the state first, and the state is responsible for determining the allocation between roads and schools. So the counties are generally restricted to using it only to fund their road departments, although I understand now that Skamania is unique, perhaps, and that they can use it for general purposes. And so the split between roads and schools varies from state to state. In Vermont, they put 100% of it to schools. The counties don't see any of it. In Oregon, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe it's a 50-50 split. Some cases it's 75-25 between schools and roads. So the split is determined by the state, and it's different. The one unique thing on the school side is that there's no requirement that the state actually send the money to school districts. And many states, including Oregon, keep the money and use it to fund the state equalization formula. So school districts in Oregon do not benefit directly from Secure Rural Schools payments. It just becomes part of the funding pot that funds schools across the state. And it's a very small part of that funding pot. So there's really a diversity of ways that it is allocated and can be used.
All right, I'd like to go back to Mark with a question because again, for Washington State, I think it's typically split pretty much 50-50, and the funds do accrue to the schools as well as the counties. And again, most counties are required to use it for their road fund. Skamania is unique in that we were given a pass and can use it in the commissioner's budget. And that basically was the result of losing 12 billion board feet when Mount St. Helens went off. And so that goes back to the 70s, I think, when we were allowed to do that. But the other one is when we talk about the trust, I've read the Crapo-Whiting bill, but it's been a while. Is there anything in that that also would accrue to the schools? Because part of the problem with PILT, I mean, we can get them to fund PILT, but again, the schools are left out of that. And it's also very interesting. I didn't have an idea of what happened with other states, and how they're able to use the school funds kind of in a discretionary fashion. Oh,
Yeah, so Washington State also does not distribute SRS funds back to individual school districts. It's retained in the state and used in the equalization funding pot. Okanagan County actually sued the state over that and lost a number of years ago. So in Montana, Idaho do send the money directly to school districts, so it's more important for schools there. The trust legislation, remember the first thing that it would do is permanently reauthorize secure rural schools and guarantee an SRS payment equal to the 2017 funding level. So it would not change the way that SRS funds can be used, at least not the Title I funds. So it would still go to both roads and schools, and it does not affect the way that the states are allowed to use that funding. So it wouldn't change Washington State's or Oregon's policy around retaining those funds for school equalization. It does change Title II and Title III. Instead of Title II being retained by the Forest Service and money being spent based on recommendations from the RACs, Title II funds would be sent directly to counties. So that's the only change in the way that SRS funds would be used. So the trust is basically a funding mechanism to guarantee permanent SRS appropriations, right? And then it makes very few changes to the way SRS works, with the exception of Title II, instead of being retained, going straight to counties.
Great. We have a question for Mark. Obviously, it's been kind of an unpredictable year for federal policy, but you know, if you were to look into the crystal ball, you know, what future opportunities do you see for secure rural schools and coming up with a solution, or more generally for payment in lieu of taxes coming up as a priority item for Congress?
I know that the two offices, Senator Wyden and Senator Crapo, have been working very hard to get the trust legislation into the stimulus conversations. They've come very close several times to getting it into the CARES Act and other proposals. Those proposals are obviously so big and the politics are so divorced from this stuff that it's kind of hard to predict whether or not it will succeed. I think they have some confidence that it will eventually, but I don't really know. You know, I think the chances probably go down the longer things drag out, unfortunately. In terms of just being able to reauthorize secure rural schools and PILT indefinitely, I think PILT is relatively secure. PILT is an incredibly popular program. The fact that PILT and secure rural schools have been divorced in the appropriations conversation in the last couple of years, I think is a bad sign for secure rural schools. If I were a county commissioner, I wouldn't be hedging my bets that it's going to be authorized every year. I'd be squirreling some money away. I can say that because it doesn't affect my budget. I'm a little distanced from the actual dollars. So, you know, I think the best bet is to continue pushing on alternatives, because I don't think SRS is a viable solution forever by itself.
all right, and I think a point that we like to make on the PILT is that when SRS is not reauthorized, basically you have more horses at the trough for PILT, and that you know, if the amount is 600 million and suddenly you've got a bunch of counties that have been getting SRS and not PILT, you now have a lot more distribution to different groups, and therefore those people that don't have timber SRS funds potentially could stand to receive fewer funds as a result of more parties being at the table.
As long as PILT is fully funded, it doesn't matter. The formula is built from the county level up, right? So the cost of PILT, it wouldn't change one county's payment based on what another county should receive, unless Congress chooses not to fully fund it. And I think the danger is that as the cost continues to rise, it's more likely that Congress decides not to fully fund it anymore. And then everyone gets a proportional cut, right? So if the timber counties do end up with a higher proportion of the PILT total because they've lost SRS, then yes, it could impact other counties more. That's been the biggest stumbling block with the Small County Payment Parity Act. I mean, it is a very small change in PILT, a couple $1 million a year at most. But it has some of the urban counties worried that if PILT isn't fully funded, they would see less money once it passes, which is true, but it's a tiny, tiny hit to the urban counties, and it would benefit the small counties substantially. But that's been a really tough point to communicate.
Typically, from a historical standpoint, has PILT been fully funded almost consistently?
It was never fully funded until 2008, and it has been fully funded since 2008 every year.
Okay, thank you.
So we may be in a new world in which it is always fully funded, but you know, history suggests that Congress has in the past decided not to. So we don't know.
Great. All right, we're down to the last minute of this webinar. I did not get through all the questions. I will note there are a number of questions from GNA, a Good Neighbor Authority, and that we will be sending out information about that webinar coming up here soon. But in the last minute, I just sort of want to pass it back to our panelists and see if you have any high-level closing remarks to, you know, end this webinar.
Thank you, Jenna, for putting it together. And I would just offer to anyone on the webinar that we've got a bunch of tools on our website, including a bunch of data about cut and sold and gross receipts coming off of national forests and the economic profile system. You can run a report for any county in the country that shows you what your payments are and how they've changed over time from Secure Rural Schools, PILT, and other programs. And so if anyone's interested in more information, feel free to reach out. I'd be happy to help. Thanks again.
All right, I'm seeing a thumbs up from Tom. Court, any final words before I go through the thank you to our sponsors? Oh, do I need to unmute you guys?
No, Mark, you had a picture of C.W. Smith and a quote. Before he was commissioner, he, of course, was a sheriff of Jackson County, an incredible guy. I don't know, you know, I retired and then come to do the commissioner thing. I've never figured out why he went from law enforcement to commissioner, about the same in the way of challenges. But thank you, everybody. And Jenna, we'll look forward to the Good Neighbor Authority if we get an invitation. Thank you, Commissioner Lannen.
You know, thank you, Commissioner Boice and Mark, appreciate it. Jenna, great job. I'm always impressed at how much information could be exchanged via Zoom as opposed to driving 80 miles and then having to spend the night and come home. So I appreciate it. Thanks to everyone.
Great. All right. And all right, thanks everyone. And thank you to Hampton Lumber, Oregon Department of Forestry, the Forest Service, Beneficial State Bank, and Timberline Lodge for helping bring these webinars to you guys and being flexible with us having to cancel our big conference only a few weeks ahead of it. So we had to, this was originally going to be an in-person breakout, and I look forward to someday being able to talk with you guys all in a more conversational space again. All right, have a great day, everyone. And a recording of this will be available here in the near future.
Thank you.
Thank you.